After the slightly questionable start that was the USS Maine, the next American attempt at an armoured cruiser would be a considerably better one. Compared to the early 1880s, American shipyards had considerably expanded, and so ordering much larger ships was possible. Thus, design work began in 1888, and by 1890, the keel of this new ship had been laid, taking just over 1 year and 2 months from keel laying to launch, with the ship entering the water on December 2nd, 1891. Commissioning took almost 2 more years, with the ship entering service on August 1st, 1893. Paradoxically, thanks to far fewer snags in the supply chain to the Philadelphia shipyards, this meant that USS New York actually entered service about 2 years before USS Maine, which weirdly enough was being built in New York. Nonetheless, displacing between 8 and 9,000 tons, depending on what status she was in terms of loading, she was powered by 4 vertical triple expansion engines, which drove 2 screws using 16,000 indicated horsepower for a design speed of 20 knots and an actual speed, as it turned out, of 21 knots when she went all out. As there were obviously therefore 2 engines per shaft, 1 engine on each could be disengaged for more economical cruising over long distances, although the disconnection and reconnection process could take a while and was a little bit complicated. Armament was quite considerable for an armoured cruiser, with a main battery layout that wouldn't be repeated until the German Scharnhorst class, utilising 6 guns with 5 capable of being used on a broadside. This armament was 4 8-inch guns in a pair of twin turrets, one forward and one aft, with 2 single 8-inch guns mounted either side amidships, albeit only in splinter-proof mountings. A dozen single 4-inch guns were arrayed in sponsons down either side, with 8 6-pounders and 4 1-pounders making up the anti-torpedo boat battery, and 3 small torpedo tubes rounding things off, one up front in the bow and one on either side. Armour, though, was relatively sparse in most areas. It was only 4-inch thick on the belt, and this only covered the machinery spaces. The armoured deck was considerably more substantial, with 6-inch slopes and 3 inches on the flat top at their thickest points, whilst the turrets had 5.5 inches of armour. Overall, therefore, the ship was amongst the most heavily armed and swiftest of her contemporaries, but could be something of a glass cannon if she ever had to face heavy incoming fire. After commissioning, New York served in the Atlantic and in European waters for the rest of the 19th century, and was one of the US Navy's ships that was closest to the Caribbean at the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. Forming up with the rest of the American ships in the vicinity, she was only able to take part in the closing stages of the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, as when the Spanish ships broke out, she was away from the blockade line, taking Admiral Sampson on to a meeting whilst in cruising mode. Between the distance that had to be covered to get back, and having half her engines offline, it took a while for the New York to catch up with the rest of the fleet. In 1901, she became the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet, remaining on this station for a couple of years before being reassigned to what at this stage was the Pacific Squadron, based on the US West Coast. In 1905, she was modernised. The main battery was removed, with a pair of new twin turrets with newer 8-inch guns and heavier armour on the turrets installed. The torpedo tubes and the secondary battery were also removed, with the side-mounted 8-inch, the whole 4-inch battery and the anti-torpedo boat guns replaced with 10 single 5-inch guns and 8 single 3-inch guns. New boilers and funnels were also installed, and she recommissioned in 1909, heading back for the Western Pacific in 1910, and being renamed to Saratoga in 1911 to free up the name New York for a brand new superdreadnought. She was briefly decommissioned in 1916 before US entry into World War I led to her being brought back into service. In 1917, she was renamed yet again, as the name Saratoga was wanted for a new battle cruiser, which obviously would later become an aircraft carrier, and so the ship was renamed to Rochester. After service as both convoy escort and troop transport, she finished the war having lost a couple of her 5-inch guns and all the 3-inch anti-torpedo boat guns in favour of the installation of a couple of 3-inch anti-aircraft guns and other modern systems. Now designated CA-2, she spent the 1920s in the Atlantic and Caribbean before heading for the Western Pacific once again in 1932, winding up in Cavite in the Philippines in 1933, where she decommissioned. She was then moored at a shipyard in Subic Bay and left there. She was still there in 1941 when the Japanese invasion saw her scuttled in place, where her wreck has subsequently become something of a tourist diver attraction, albeit that work in the 1960s to allow tankers into the area has partially damaged what was otherwise a fairly intact wreck.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.